to the Enfield Caribbean Association Black History event. I'm Desiree Thompson-George, Vice Chair of the Enfield Caribbean Association and your host for this evening. We are gathered this evening to acknowledge and celebrate the achievements and contributions of those Africans who were here in Britain before us, and specifically before 1948. Much of what we will hear from the keynote speaker will be new to most of us, because we were not taught anything about Black history at school, apart from how Granville Sharp and William Wilberforce campaigned tirelessly for the abolition of slavery. There was no mention of the fact that Black people were actually involved in this in any way, or involved in driving the campaign. There were never any positive references to Black people. No achievements were attributed to them. Our history, and as you will see, a substantial part of British history, remained hidden. Life, we now know, began in Africa, so there is a lot to celebrate. about time we've all been waiting for. Our next guest has a very long list of achievements, and if I was to attempt to share them all with you, we'd be here until tomorrow. So, it's suffice to say that he is the reader at Chichester University in the history of Africa and African diaspora. He is the author of several books, including 3 for children, one of which will be available from the 11th of December, entitled The History of the African and Caribbean Communities in Britain. He is also an international speaker on many topics, including the history of Pan-Africanism and communism. But this evening, he will be taking us on a journey to reveal some of our hidden history. So please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Dr. Hakeem Adib.
Good evening, Enfield. Good evening. Oh dear. Sorry. Good evening, Enfield. Are you ready? Who was the first African ruler of Britain? Oh, okay, Septimus Severus. You sure? 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 Wrong. It's wrong. Okay, the first African ruler of Britain was not Septimus Severus. Who told you that? A quiz? Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay, so everyone's going to buy a copy of the book. Okay, that's great. So the answer is Quintus Livius Urbicus, another Roman. He wasn't Roman emperor, but he was the governor of Britain before Septimus Severus. And Quintus came from what is today Algeria, a Berber in origin. He ruled Britain in the 2nd century before Septimus Severus. Septimus Severus came from what is today Libya in North Africa, so he was the second African ruler of Britain, and of course he was Roman emperor as well. Okay, I'm going to give you an easy one now. So the next question is, who was the first dreadlocks in Britain? First dreadlocks in Britain also came with Septimus Severus in the 3rd century. We're not quite sure actually the date of this. He was a cavalry person. I mean, there were many dreadlocked cavalry people. African dreadlock, Roman cavalry in Britain in the 3rd century. When did you think the first dreadlock came to Britain? Okay, so 3rd century. So, Africans have been in Britain since that time. Maybe even before, but certainly since Roman times. Okay, in the centuries after Roman times, we have fewer pictures, less information. This is from the 13th century, I think, if I remember rightly. It's just a picture, though, of an African man illustrating the Doomsday Book. You remember the Doomsday Book, William the Conqueror? Okay, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this man was here. He was just drawn during that time. But of course, this is the time when Africans ruled parts of Europe. Do you know there were African rulers in Spain, African rulers in Portugal, between 800 and 1500 for nearly 700 years, when Spain and Portugal were the most civilized parts, most developed parts of Europe, when science flourished and so on. And some of those Africans from Spain and Portugal probably came to Britain. I just wanted to talk about Africa for a moment, because sometimes when we talk about history, people present Africa in a negative light. But if we go back about 600 years, we see Africa portrayed very differently. So this is one of the first European maps of Africa in the Middle Ages from the early 14th century, a Spanish map. And you'll see in this map, we have here an African king We're not necessarily sure who this African king is, but he could be the very famous African emperor called Mansa Musa. You heard of Mansa Musa? Some people have heard of Mansa Musa. And it was rumoured at the time that Mansa Musa could have been the richest king in the world. There's a story of him that he went on pilgrimage. He was a Muslim. He went on the Hajj to Mecca. While going on the pilgrimage, he stopped off in Cairo. The story is that he took so much gold with him from the West African Empire of Mali that the gold value plummeted internationally for 20 years. He just dropped off gold as presents to people. So that shows you some of the wealth that Africa had at that time. And of course the reason Europeans were interested in Africa was not because it was poor or underdeveloped, but because it was rich, developed, it had gold, it had spices. Imagine eating your food with no spices. Okay, let's leave Mansa Musa. But of course, during Mansa Musa's time, you had the development of the famous city of Timbuktu. You heard of Timbuktu? With its famous manuscripts. All the trade that was carried on in Timbuktu, people say that the book trade was the most important trade. There were many scholars there, learned men, women, studying all kinds of things. So books like these manuscripts are what Timbuktu was famous for. And the relationship between Britain and Africa at that time, okay, we may not know too much about it, but strange things turn up in history. When Britain invaded what is today Ghana, the kingdom of Ashanti in the 19th century, they found these three vases. And these three vases come from England, and England in the 14th century at the time of Richard II. And even today, no one knows exactly how they ended up in West Africa. Whether somebody from Britain went to West Africa, somebody from West Africa came to Britain, whether there was trade between the kingdom of Ashanti or its forerunners and England, nobody yet knows. This is from the early 16th century. The gentleman on the extreme right in the middle, anyone remember his name from the quiz? John Blank, very, very good. And he was a trumpeter at the time of Henry VII in the royal court. And he's just one example, one illustration of the fact that there were many Africans in England at the time of Elizabeth I, Henry VII, Henry VIII, in this Tudor period. Some people think that Shakespeare himself had an African lady friend and that wrote some of his sonnets to that lady friend. This is one of Shakespeare's famous sonnets, Sonnet 130. He wrote about 20 sonnets to a woman that historians have sometimes called her the Dark Lady. Some people think it was a woman called Lucy Morgan, or some people call her Lucy Negro, who lived in Clerkenwell. And I'm just going to give you a little bit of this. You can see some of the interesting things. If hairs be wires, black wires go on her head, blah, 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 and so on and so forth. Let's just have a look at quickly a couple more. These from two other sonnets. The bottom one's interesting. Shakespeare was the first person to say black is beautiful. This is one of the letters written during the time of Elizabeth I. As you can see, one of the things she says is there were too many Africans in England at that time. We won't go into why she said that. And we know there were many Africans at the royal courts doing different things, working in different professions, as divers, as in a range of occupations during that time. Then we come to the part that we prefer to ignore, but we can't. Because it's that time which created the modern world, including Britain. Everything that we see in Britain today, everything we see in the world today, was created from the labour, the brains of African men, women and children. Not only African men, women and children, but without Africans there would be no modern world. We come to the time of enslavement, but of course we also come to the time of resistance, of enslavement, which is sometimes something we don't hear very much about. And that resistance became so strong, in the end, the trafficking of human beings, which was the main trade Britain in the 18th century, was forced to come to conclusion. And one of the key events which brought that trafficking of Africans to a conclusion is presented in this picture. It's a picture of Toussaint Louverture on the right, and he's receiving the surrender of the British Army. Because Toussaint and the revolutionaries in Saint-Domingue, Haiti today, defeated not only the British Army, also the French Army, and also the Spanish Army. The three principal armies in the world were defeated by the armies of Africans living in Haiti during this period. And this is one of the most important events which led to an end to the trafficking of Africans. So I wanted to say something about some of those Africans who came to Britain or brought to Britain during the 18th century. This is one of the most famous of them. His name was Ayuba Suleiman Diallo. He came from what is today Senegal. He was brought to Britain. He was a person who was kidnapped, enslaved, but it was found that he was a person who spoke Arabic fluently and who could recite the Quran by heart, that he wasn't an ordinary person. He was brought to Britain in 1733, where he did a number of things. One of the things which he did was he wrote the whole of the Quran by memory. And here we have another picture of him here. Here's a copy of the Quran which he wrote. It was sold at Bonhams for about £20,000 quite recently. His memoirs were written, and he became one of the first Africans to have a biography written about him. And then he was returned to Africa. He is an unusual case. Okay, I'm going to just present another unusual case. This is a man called, anyone know who it is? Who? It's a man called William Ansah. William Ansah he came from what is today Ghana. He was the son of a trafficker, because of course, as you know, there were African traffickers as well as English and European traffickers. He was the son of a trafficker in human beings who sent him to England to be educated, but unfortunately en route to England he himself was kidnapped and enslaved and taken to Barbados. And as you might imagine, his father was rather upset that his favourite son had been kidnapped. He immediately sent a message to the Royal Africa Company. I don't know whether you know that the trafficking of human beings, trafficking of Africans, was organised by monopoly companies, all of which were headed by the king or the queen. So every king or queen from Elizabeth I to Victoria, they were all connected, all associated, all involved with trafficking Africans. William Ansah's father wrote to the Royal Africa Company, the company responsible for trafficking. He said, unless my son is returned immediately, I will not export any other enslaved Africans. The Royal Africa Company immediately sent its envoys to Barbados. They freed William Ansah. They brought him to London. They gave him his nice suit of clothes. They took him to the opera, took him to the theatre, let him stay with the president of the Board of Trade, who was the government minister responsible for the slave trade. He had a nice holiday here, and then he went home to Africa. His father said, thank you very much. Trade can now continue as normal. These two are unusual. Of course, most Africans who were here, or many Africans who were here in the 18th century, did not have such an easy time. But I'm going to talk about one or two others first. This is a picture that's lent to me by Her Majesty the Queen. I said I was coming to Enfield tonight. She said, Hakeem, you must take this photo and show it to people. And she said to me, it's a very unusual picture. I said, why is that? She said, because if you watch Trooping of the Colour every June, as I do, because Trooping of the Colour is around my birthday, and when I was a child I used to think it was especially for me, you will not see any Africans in one of the household regiments. The last one resigned because he said there was too much racism. But here in the 18th century we have a picture of a trumpeter in one of the monarch's household regiments. So in the 18th century, Africans were here in all kinds of professions. Here we have another one. This is you've heard about highwaymen. This is an African highway woman. Okay? It's only a sketch, but it's a representative sketch of what existed at that time. So as I said, all kinds of professions, household cavalry, highway woman. Here we have a stagecoach boy who with his horn would announce the coming of the mail and so on and so forth. So all this is 18th century. Okay. And then we come to a typical picture from that period. This is actually, what's interesting about this picture is we know the name of the guy on the right-hand side, but we don't know the name of the guy on the left-hand side. The guy on the right-hand side is the second Duke of Perth. And like all rich people in the 18th century, he wanted his portrait painted to show how rich he was. And to show how rich he was, he had a slave, an enslaved person. And having enslaved African children, or sometimes Indian children in the 18th century, was a sign of status. They were treated a little bit like pets, as you can see here. Here, this one has this young boy has a collar, just like your dog or cat at home, those of you who have dogs and cats. It would depend on what the owner, sometimes it would be silver collar, sometimes gold collar, sometimes leather and so on. And like your pets, those of you who have pets, these African children were given pet names. They used to like Roman names, so Pompey